Hope everyone's doing well. Welcome to the MAGIA Mindset. Today's guest is a sports psychologist that has worked alongside individuals, teams, and organizations globally. He is the author of 4 best-selling sports psychology books. It is my absolute pleasure to welcome Dan Abrahams. Roll the intro. Dan, I know it's really been a busy time for you, especially in this unique year we're in. So I, again, truly appreciate it for you putting in the time to get on the show and talk about the beautiful game.
No problem at all. I'm delighted and honored to be here, Shawn. Thank you for asking me on.
For sure. One of the main things I want to kind of talk to you and get the ball rolling with is the mindset, and not just the mindset of the average individual, but the most elite. And what is it that put them in the situation they're at? What is the characteristics? And I don't even want to talk about only the athletes, but the athletes, the coaching staff, the front office, all of the people within the highest organization. What are those characteristics that got them there? And what allows them to sustain it for so long?
Sure. Well, it's a good question, and in many respects, it's quite a tough question to open with because there's so many different ways that people excel, and so many different qualities they have that help them to excel. And I must be honest with you, Shawn, I'm not one of these psychologists who would say, well, it's just about the mindset and it's completely mind over matter. The reality is that the very elite that you're watching on TV, who are playing in the biggest leagues in the world, the reality is they do have a great degree of ability. They have a great degree of talent. When they train, when they practice from a very early age, they have a greater adaptation to that practice, so they improve quicker than others. The reality is that is dead, and I don't think it's actually very positive or pragmatic to deny that. So the first thing I would say, and I know I'm not directly talking about a personality characteristic or a mindset characteristic there, but we do have to accept that a lot of these guys have a lot of skill in their feet. That's the reality. If we're talking about soccer, if we're talking about football. Following that, I do think the best players practice, train very well. Whether one defines that as an intensity of training or an intensity of practice, by and large, they tend to be pretty good at that. But I also think quite a few of them are very, very good at practicing with a great deal of quality. Quite often what you find is the best players on the team are the ones who've thoughtfully or thought about the specific things that they want to improve upon. And they don't just rely on the activities that are given to them. They'll go into those activities, the rondos, the small-sided games, the keep balls, etc., with specific things that they want to improve in mind. There's an element of deliberate practice about them. There's an element of training with intention. So I think good practice habits is a differentiator. And then I think in terms of if we were really to dive into the specifics of competitive mindset, you'd think of the obvious psychological qualities that they might have, the capacity to concentrate on the task at hand. I think the best soccer players in the world are often the ones who are the best at constantly scanning their environment as the game goes on around them. They're able to constantly pay attention to the subtle little clues and cues and triggers that are unfolding during the game, that are emerging and dissolving as they're played in front of them. And you'd think of your Javis Xavis and your Iniestas and your Messis who are past masters of doing that. Yes, they have a lot of skill in their boots, in their shoes, but they're also in their feet, but they're also very, very good at scanning what's going on around them and making very quick decisions based on that, anticipating quickly, essentially. They play with confidence, and perhaps if they've lost a bit of confidence, they're still able to compete with a positive intent or a positive action. They're able to compete with an ideal intensity. If they find themselves getting too intense, perhaps through anxiety or perhaps through anger or frustration, they're able to bring themselves down a little bit to where they ideally should be. Or perhaps if they're feeling flat or lethargic, they were able to lift themselves up a little bit. So there's attention, there's intensity, there's intent, there's confidence as well. There's a sense of self-control most of the time. Look, the best players in the world are human beings. So the reality is sometimes they don't execute with self-control. Sometimes they perhaps do lose it a little bit, aren't always emotionally managing themselves. But quite often you find the very best are better at doing that, at emotionally managing. So there's an air of self-control to their game. I think the final thing to say, I want to close here. I opened with talent, just having that little bit more ability than other people. And I think that's the reality of it. What I'd also like to say here, just to close with this question is, as I said, these people are human beings. Anxiety happens to them. Low confidence happens to them. Low mood happens to them. Worry, doubt, fear. These things happen to them. So it's not that they don't experience these negative emotions or negative aspects to what it is to be a human being. It might just be that they're happy to share vulnerabilities with considered others. Or maybe it's just that they're slightly better at dealing with those negative human traits. That would be the final thing to say there.
No, that's brilliant. One of the things I want to kind of transition with is how can a coach apply sports psych into verbiage used at training aside from just saying good job? And I kind of want to go into the word confidence can really be challenging for players, especially when in the heat of the moment. Aside from visualization, how can we as coaches, players, to think, act more confidently within training sessions while not disrupting the flow?
Yeah, sure. So, there's a couple of things that came out there from what you were saying. You were talking about performing under pressure and performing with confidence under pressure. You were talking about training and coaches being able to train their players with confidence or help them develop confidence in training. There's so much one can say here, but let's begin at the beginning, and let's begin in very simple terms. The definition of confidence is that there's so many different definitions of confidence, I think. And I think where we could start here is confidence as a behavior. Confidence as a behavior. If I was a coach, and I'm not a soccer coach, but if I was a coach, I would be asking players to show me confidence, to demonstrate confidence as a behavior, a positive intent, if you like. So let's say we've got a rondo or a keep ball or a small-sided game or something like that. One of my instructions might be, or one of the tasks I would set my players would be to execute everything with confidence. I think this is the interesting thing about confidence is we could make it very complex, and maybe we'll go on and talk about that, or we could make it very simple. If I said to you, Shawn, okay, we're going to do a rondo here, and I want you in that rondo to execute everything with confidence. Show me what confidence looks like. Show me what confidence looks like. I bet you could pass with confidence. You could run with confidence. You could challenge or tackle with confidence. You could execute every action with confidence. You know what? It's just that we don't attune players towards that kind of attention. And that's often what I'm asking coaches to do. I just say, look, if that player's lacking a bit of confidence right now, just ask them to show you what confidence looks like. It's a stunningly simple thing that people often ignore or don't even think about doing, that actually is very, very effective. So that would be my first message, is to just ask players to demonstrate confidence behaviorally. What does that look like? What does that feel like? Show me that in the rondo. If you lose possession, doesn't matter. So I think the second thing to layer on top of that is to give players permission to fail. Give players permission to give the ball away, to make a sloppy tackle or challenge, to find themselves out of position or something like that. Look, that happens. That's okay. But I want you to react and respond with those confident behaviors. Confident behaviors. So showing confident behaviors, giving players permission to fail. We could get a little bit more complex here. We could then start to talk to players about self-talk. Self-talk, talking to yourself. What you often find is champions in all sports are champions in part because they're very good at dealing with the tough times. And how they do that, how they deliver on that, quite often is related to how well they're talking to themselves at any given time. They talk, champions are champions because they talk their way through problems. They talk their way through challenges. So that their own private voice matters to them. And there's different styles in which you can talk to yourself, in different styles in which you can use your self-talk. You can use energizing language. You can use positive language. You can use instructional language. So introducing players to the notion of self-talk can be very, very useful. Final thing to say here, I mean, yes, you mentioned that word, visualization. You can have players picture their performance, and there is some scientific evidence to suggest that that can help players execute their technique, execute under pressure. So visualization is always there or thereabouts when it comes to psychological intervention. But the final thing to say is, I always say coaching is about stretch and support. I think coaches have two dials, a stretch dial and a support dial. And if you're going to make your training sessions tough, so you're going to stretch, you're going to turn up the volume of stretch, you also need to turn up the volume of support. And as you mentioned earlier, that can be through your voice. You can say, good job, good job. You can also remind players to execute with confidence. You can remind them to use their self-talk. You can remind them to help each other as well. So those are the little things that coaches can use to help players play with confidence and build confidence.
No, that's great. Thank you so much. Dan, one of the things I want to kind of get into now, dealing with talented players, and at the highest level talented players, there are moments that as a coach you're observing and you're understanding that this player's tanking it. He's tanking it. And it usually happens with the talented players, how they're feeling like they're getting taken to, and they're tanking it because they don't want to show that the other person really beat them in a mindset. I want to go and talk about those moments, if they're tanking it, or at times not putting their 100% effort in. As a coach that we're observing it, what is it do we step into? Do we sit back and say, if I say this, is he gonna get a pushback? Do I let my pride get into it and dig into him and let him know that this is unacceptable? Or that's just gonna be a tug of war action? In those moments when you don't want to lose your player, but you're feeling like you're losing him, how do you put him on track and bringing him back into the game?
Wow, it's a great question, and I mean, I suppose the overarching philosophy you're talking about, it feels very akin to Professor Carol Dweck's growth and fixed mindset, that people with a great ability in a certain discipline or domain, in our case, football, soccer, people who have that great deal of ability tend to protect that ability because it tends to define them and it tends to define their participation within that domain. So in our case, football, soccer. So young soccer players who are ultra talented see themselves as talented and try to protect the perception of that talent. In their own minds, they might feel that they don't want to show others that they don't have that ability. So I think the first thing to say is there is an onus on a coach and an onus on key stakeholders to try to avoid that term talent as much as possible, and to avoid overly praising performance in many respects, and actually being more inquisitive around the how, the process, essentially. If I've got a player with a young player with a great deal of ability, I want to engage that young player in questions really around what they're looking at, what they're seeing, why they made that decision, how they're going about what they're doing. Essentially, I want to be inquisitive as a coach, so that young player starts to be inquisitive about what they're doing. When you do that, you arm that young player with knowledge. You help them consider and think about the specific things they're doing that help them attain the performances they're actually attaining. So it really is about asking process questions, growth questions, rather than just simply praising performance. Hey, that was awesome. You were incredible out there today. Wow. You just play well every single time. Well, wow. I mean, isn't it inevitable that that young player is going to become addicted to that feeling he or she gets based on your praise? I'm not saying never praise. I'm just saying one might want to consider rationing that praise, essentially, dishing it out now and again rather than all the time. But rather asking them, hey, I saw you score a goal today. It was a great goal. What did you do that helped you to score that goal? What were you looking at? I saw you make that great run and get on the end of the cross. What did you observe that made you make that run, that helped you to lose the defender? That was really, really good. I really love what you did there. Tell me more about that. So can you see how you're helping that young person really engage in the specifics of what they're doing on the pitch or the field? And then you can reinforce those specifics. Oh, I see what you're saying there. You saw the defender just move slightly to your right, so you peeled away, moved off to the left. That gave you that bit of space. Oh, I love that there. When might you use that on other occasions? Okay, or can we think about you looking at doing that in a slightly different way next time? Tell me more about that. You're just engaging them. You're helping them become a student of the game and a student of their game. For me, that's how you steer them, I should say, help to steer them away from a fixed mindset, one that's constantly concerned and worried about showing how great they are. Let's start to analyze the process of performance rather than praising the performance itself.
No, that's great. And if we got to go into analyzing a specific performance, I just wanted to bring like a couple examples out in the World Cup. Let's just talk about the World Cup. There was a World Cup between Germany and Brazil that was 7-2 in Brazil. There was against Holland and Spain. I believe that was 5-0 or 6-0, where the former champs, the highest level, same thing with Brazil. They're supposed to be expected to win in Brazil. Those kind of results take it to them. When you're observing as a psychologist or as a coach from the outside in, what is it that is setting up for a situation like that? What is it prior that they weren't mentally ready? Was there certain things that you're like, that's interesting how they went into it? Evaluations of, was it too much of a peak performance? I want to kind of dive into that kind of specific as the outside in observing. What are the key moments that you're gaining from those kind of two matches? Yeah,
sure. Well, there were two very fascinating matches, especially the 7-2 to Germany, an incredibly emphatic semi-final scoreline. And I think it was 2004 2014, wasn't it?
Yes.
And I think, look, I mean, the first thing to say is I wasn't involved in either any of those camps. So as a sports psychologist, I have to ethically say that, because it's like, well, I wasn't on the inside, so I don't 100% know the ins and outs of what they were experiencing. But look, let's respectfully take some, as I say, respectful guesses as to what was going on. I mean, you used that word, Shawn, expectation, and that's a brutal word in sport, especially adult elite sport that we're talking about here. There were a great deal of expectations on Brazil in the 2014 World Cup. It was their home World Cup. Brazil, arguably the greatest international team of all time, you know, in terms of World Cup wins, etc., etc. So there was an enormous amount of pressure, and so subsequently, the perception of, well, we've got to win this. We're at home. We've got to win this. Increases feelings of anxiety, sensations of fear, and which would probably turn up the volume of worry and doubt. I think their captain was, well, no, that's right, Neymar was he banned or was he injured? He was injured, wasn't he?
He got injured in the game before.
That's right. So arguably their best player was off the pitch. So that would have certainly turned up the volume of worry, and I think subsequently they've kind of admitted to that actually happening. So look, what we're seeing there is performance anxiety. During that game, performance anxiety, I mean, there was something like 3-4-0 down within the first half an hour. So how does that manifest itself? You ask me, what am I watching? Well, I'm watching behavior. You know, right? Yes, I'm watching the body language, but let's be more specific here within soccer. You're looking at the positioning of the players. You're looking at the movement and the runs, and you're looking at the team togetherness, I suppose, the way that they're working together. I mean, the actions they were demonstrated looked quite anxious. If you actually look at some of the footage, I mean, the Germans' capacity to lose the defenders, the midfielders, the ability to rip Brazil apart, because Brazil were a little bit slower, a bit more tunnel visioned. Their decisions were slower. Their decisions were arguably quite poor. It's working on a behavioral level, that performance anxiety, less awareness, slower anticipation, poor decisions, slower decisions. It leads to being 3 or 4 down after half an hour. Now, what could that team have done in the lead up, given that our best player is out? It's a home World Cup. The pressure is on us. Now, the reality is, Shawn, is there's possibly nobody on planet Earth who may have been able to help them, who may not have been able to help them. I mean, it might have been an impossible situation. You have to be realistic about that. But if myself, or perhaps somebody like myself, was in on the inside, you really would have wanted to have had these kind of conversations in, well, not even in the lead up to the World Cup, a long, long time before. You really want them a year to 2 years prior. You really want to set your environment, a psychologically informed environment, miles before actually that World Cup happens. You want to be talking in small groups when the team does get together, or did get together in international breaks. You wanted to be formulating plans around that. You wanted to probably build what we would call in psychology a shared mental model. Probably you'd want every single player to have a mental framework themselves. So, Thiago Silva, how do you go about being the best that you can be mentally, a high-performance mindset? Neymar, how do you go about doing that? All the other players, how do you go about doing that? And then, how can we help each other be in our high-performance mindset, no matter what? And then talking about the what ifs. What if Neymar gets injured? You know, what if Germany or a team that we're going to be playing against come out the blocks and a goal or two up within 10, 15 minutes? How are we going to react and respond? What mental tools have we got to be able to do that? So that's very much building frameworks, mental frameworks, sharing those mental frameworks. One last thing to say here. As a sports psychologist, I would also be wanting to work with individual players and in small groups, and maybe in the bigger group, if possible, to start talking about broadening the kind of experiences that we'd want in the World Cup, perhaps changing the narrative and the meaning. The narrative, the probable narrative at that time is, we're Brazil, we're the best, we're in a home World Cup, we've got to win. Everybody expects us to win. I would be striving to change a narrative and look at more meaningfuls around joy and fun and all the things that players will have done, those Brazilian players would have done growing up in the favelas and on the beaches, and that sounds kind of cliche, I know, but just the joy the Brazilians get from playing soccer, how they express themselves on the pitch. I would want them in that mindset, rather than we've got to win, we got to win, we got to win, we got to perform, we got to perform. We'd have to have open and honest conversations there. We'd have to give those players permission to express vulnerability individually, in small groups, and as a large group. If we could have gotten them there, then I don't know, maybe there may have been a different result.
No, that's brilliant. One of the things I want to kind of now get into, it's kind of your basically planning in the camps you worked with. One of the most significant camps you worked in, and how does it look like a day in those camps? What is the setup? When does it start? What do you have to, what's the main focuses you try to hit? What do you try to first go into and see from your players, as well as that, to kind of manage it and then time it well where you want it to peak and you want their peak performances to happen?
Wow. Again, I would say a lot of the hard work is going to be done prior to the camp, going into camp. And let's, if we're talking football, soccer here, I mean, I function I'm in England, and I function heavily in the Premier League. One could differentiate between working as a sports psychologist with a Premier League team or a Championship team here in England, relative to working with an international team, which would be more camp-based. But I've done that, and I would say if you're working with an international team in a camp, again, a lot of the work is done prior to the camp in terms of what you're trying to achieve, what you're trying to achieve with the players. And I think you've got to heavily involve players in that. I mean, I'd like to say that, because I think that's where the landscape has heavily changed, is that I do think that you have to, and I think this is where Gareth Southgate, for instance, the England head coach, manager, has changed things a little bit with the England team, is being more what we would call autonomy supportive, getting the players more involved with the decision making, being more player centered, not completely player led, that's different, but being player centered rather than simply coach led. So these days, you're looking at players arriving on site and being ready for what you're going to deliver, because they will have been involved in decision making, and there would have been a lot of conversation off site going into the camp. In terms of what a day looks like, that's obviously when you're in execution mode. You're up early, considering the day ahead, maybe answering emails early doors. And then often those days start with a meeting, a coach meeting. And as a sports psychologist, I'm observing in those coach meetings, because a lot of the work you do as a sports psychologist is through coaches, is with coaches and through coaches. In international camps, there's not a lot of time. There's not a lot of face time with players. They're either in training or they're on downtime, enjoying rest and recuperation. So there's not a lot of time to actually do FaceTime with players. So you've got to do a lot of work through the coaches, because they've got the boots on the grass. They've got a lot more FaceTime and time with players. So my job in a meeting is to observe the meeting, How are those coaches communicating? Are they communicating effectively? Is the whole, through to specific stuff such as, how is the head coach functioning with the assistant coaches? I'm then taking note of what's being said, what the plan for the day is, what I will be observing as well. We'll talk probably a little bit about psychology and what we can deliver on that day. Again, that would probably have been pre-planned, but what that looks like in real terms. And then we're out on the grass. We might have some breakfast and hopefully have some breakfast with the players, and having a chat with them, and then out on the grass. And then I'm standing back and I'm observing. It's quite a popular thing for sports psychs to get involved with the kit man and the other kit man or kit woman, and get involved with them and help out with various stuff, bits and pieces. But you do want to try and have some space to observe. And see what's going on. And there's that small-sided, the rondo, the keep ball, the passing activity, the 11v11, 7v7, whatever it is that's going on, you're observing. And quite often coaches are asking me to observe them. They might say, can you observe? Can you observe my energy? Can you observe my standards? Can you observe whether I'm, my behaviors? How well am I coaching on the run? So observation is important. And I do think the future might look more like a sports psychologist having boots on the ground as well, putting their boots on, getting out there and being able to speak with players during coaching sessions, between activities. I think that's going to be a vital part of the future as well. And then after training is done, after a bit of lunch, it's usually a coach's debrief. And we're having a good, honest, open conversation, vulnerable conversation about what went well, what can we improve upon, is there anything we need to add next time, and then really the rest of the day might be reserved for one-to-ones with coaches, one-to-ones with players, or small group sessions with players, or even small group sessions with coaches and players. So it's a fairly busy day, packed out day, and that's kind of gives you an idea what a camp might look like.
No, I mean, that's fantastic. And it's great that we touched on that. But I think the main vision of it going into now is Premier League. And I want to get into the Premier League because the Premier League, yes, the Champions League, they can say it's the highest competition as well. But as an overall league, I think the World Cup, even though it's a popular sport, it looks like it's the off season for a lot of these elite players, because the goal they're going through, especially in the Premier League, how long the season is, mentally, physically, by the time, if it's World Cup season and that month is hitting, it's the end of it. A lot of their bodies are already in off season. They want to kind of shut it down. They're going there to represent the national team. But that's why certain elite players, their performances, you're like, why is it not looking at the highest in these things? Because of the toll of the Premier League. So I want to kind of get into the Premier League, and we're talking about observing the coaches. How is it, especially now when you're dealing with the Premier League, that they have their academies, okay? So you're getting players coming in from outside, you're getting academy players developing, but as a coach, you're put in tough situations where you got to let players know that they've been here for X amount of years, that they're going out. They're not going to be part of the plans going forward. Some players that have been contributing a lot, as age hit, they're going to be let know that, hey, this is where it's a business. We got to go different directions. These are tough conversations to have with players. As a coach, when you're observing and you're having talks with coaches or certain things, if they're coming to you to see if they're evaluating, how do you go upon delivering these messages within a Premier League team with these players?
Sure. So I think what you're asking me there is how do coaches communicate effectively with players at different levels of their career, when they're just starting out, when they're perhaps transitioning into transitioning away from their career into, I suppose, normal life, normal in inverted commas. And look, I think coaching communication is vital. Having people skills is important. The capacity to listen, to empathize, to ask the right questions, to suggest when appropriate, but also to elicit the answer from players themselves, I think is vital. I'm a big believer that coaches nowadays need to learn some linguistic frameworks to help them communicate with players, to help them connect with players, to help build their relationship with players. Whether it's on my podcast, if you don't mind me saying, and or through articles or blogs or whatever, I'm often talking with coaches about using those psychological frameworks that give you tools. I think if I was to pinpoint a couple of things, I think in coaching, we're very, very socialized into a fix-it mentality. We believe coaches tend to see coaching as, I have an expertise, I have all this knowledge and all this information, I have to give it to players. And a good friend of mine, Stuart Armstrong, I love what he says. He says to coaches that it's probably important to wear your expertise lightly. Wear your expertise lightly, and not be so affixed to this philosophy of you've got to tell players what to do. You've got to tell players you've got to tell players how they should be and how they should think and how they should feel, and be a little bit more robust from a communication standpoint in terms of helping uncover how a player feels and how that player best thinks that he or she should go about certain things. And I think, therefore, that the skill of listening is important. For instance, player X, I'm Coach Y. Coach Y says to player X, hey, hey, player X, let's call player X Joe. Hey, Joe, I've noticed you've looked a little bit distant the last few weeks. I know this is your last season with us here. It looks a little bit like you're dwelling on that now, and you're possibly thinking about things in the future. Pause. Let Joe, tell you what he is thinking about. Yeah, coach, I really want to get this season done. I want it to be good because it's my last season. I want to impress, and I'm just, I'm just feeling a bit of anxiety right now. Coach says to Joe, okay, I hear what you're saying there. You're feeling anxious, are you? That's what we would call an empathy statement. I hear that you're feeling anxious. You're empathizing. So you're listening to what Joe's got to say, and then you're empathizing. It's not, oh, well, come on, Joe, come on, this is your last season. Buck up, boy. You got to, come on, you can do it. You've done really well the last few years. You can score those goals. No, let's take a step back. Let's listen to how Joe is feeling. Let's exhibit some empathy here. Joe, it sounds like you're really anxious right now. Pause. Give Joe a chance to answer. Yeah, coach, I'm feeling really, really anxious. It's really getting to me. And, I just don't really know what to do about it. And then as a coach, rather than go, well, here's your tools and techniques, this is what you can use, which you can do, maybe we need to ask another question. For instance, Joe, is there any time during your career when you've been anxious, where you've been able to deal with that anxiety effectively? And you might get Joe thinking about a time during his career when he's dealt with anxiety, and Joe might go, yeah, you know what, coach, when I used to get anxious on the pitch, I used to talk to myself positively. I used to remind myself of my best games, and I used to picture that and think about it. Oh, what I hear you say there, Joe, is you used to use visualization. I know quite a bit about visualization. Perhaps we can work on that together. And you talked about your best games. Perhaps we can talk a little bit about your best games. So you're reflecting back what you're hearing, and that leads on to a suggestion. Perhaps we can talk about that. And Joe goes, yeah, maybe we can talk about it. Can you see how really effective communication can help players deal with the challenges that they have during their career? As you say, when they're starting out, when they're in the middle of their career, when they're coming to the end of their career. Listening, empathy, open-ended questions, reflecting back what you hear to players. These are the kind of communication skills that modern day coaches need.
No, that's fantastic. One of the things I want to kind of conclude the Premier League discussion on is, in the Premier League, you start out the season in August. The preparation really happens in July. It concludes end of May. Now, if you go into Champions League, it goes kind of a little bit into June. You're really getting a month in between off, okay? And it's a very long season. You got the Christmas holiday at times too, but it's a long season. When you've worked with these organizations and you're talking to some of these players, how is it now that we're not in camps, we're in a season, how is it throughout the year you manage the phases? What is the priorities in August, September, October? Then what is the priorities in November, December, before the break in January? And then the final conclusion when you're coming in the final run of February to the final of the season, what are the priorities in those phases?
Yeah, sure. Good question. I think you said something interesting there, Shawn. You mentioned a Christmas break. At the moment, there's no Christmas break, and there never has been in English football, which has been a big bone of contention. And my understanding, and obviously COVID has put a bit of a spanner in the works, I believe, but my understanding is we're not far away now from having a Christmas break like they have across Europe, which makes the season a bit more digestible. Look, I think it's a great question. And one thing I'd say here is, not being a football coach, a soccer coach, I'm not too sure if I'm the best person to answer the question about how one periodizes anything, because it's not my expertise. But maybe how I could answer that is actually say that if we look at that July period and we look at the August period, usually in a normal season, when we're not in normal circumstances right now, but usually in a normal season, the Premier League kicks off, as you quite rightly say, in mid-August. So pre-season tends to be a month and a half. And that is usually when managers and their coaches, so we call a head coach over here in England a manager. Usually it's when managers and their coaches are working on their game models. They're working on fitness and game models. And this is where I think, this is what I would say as a sports psychologist, I think this period is a wonderful opportunity for coaches and their players to work on mental frameworks, each and every individual, and then sharing those mental frameworks. As I mentioned, and that was an answer to a question about half an hour ago, every individual having a mental framework and every individual sharing as a group that mental framework. So we have some task cohesion. That's called task cohesion. What we're very not guilty of, what we tend to do a lot of in sport, is a lot of social cohesion. So in pre-season in July, we'll go on a pre-season tour, and there might be a lot of social cohesion stuff. So there'll be things around, we'll go canoeing together, or we'll go rock climbing together, we'll do something together. And that's great and that's wonderful. So that's a lot of social cohesion. But what there's not a lot of is task cohesion. Everybody cohesively coming around a task, around the mental side of the game. It tends to revolve just around the game model. This is how we play. These are our roles. These are the responsibilities within our role. Now, I think every single player should have a mental framework, and every single player should be sharing that mental or those mental frameworks. So that's what I think that teams, coaches, managers, players should be doing in July, beginning of August, going into the season. Because in game one, game one, personally, I want those players hitting the ground, running, ready mentally to deal with that first game for 95 minutes. I think that's absolutely vital. In terms of the rest of the season, look, what I would say, what I experience a lot as a sports psychologist, are players, those games come thick and fast, especially around Christmas right now. And there's not a lot of breathing space. There's not a lot of time to rest and recuperate. So something I'm always talking about with players is giving themselves active rest, or at least time to switch off. What you find with a lot of the elite players in the Premier League is actually they overthink. They think too much about their game. They might train for an hour and a half, do a few extras, do a little bit of stuff in the gym, then they go home. But what they don't do at home is they don't necessarily switch off and get away from the game. So one of the things I'm always talking to them about is 1% time. I call it 1% time. So 1% is about 15 minutes of your day. It's about 15 minutes of your day. I say to players, look, train for your hour and a half, do your extras, whatever that looks like, do your gym work if that's what you do. Then when you go home, spend 1% of your time, 15 minutes, thinking about, visualizing, picturing, considering, reflecting on your football, your soccer. Okay, that might be thinking about your best game, your dream game. It might be thinking about your training, reflecting on the positives from your training, thinking about your week ahead, thinking about the game ahead. Just 1% of your time. A pocket of 2 minutes, a pocket of 3 minutes here and there. That's time well spent. And then for the rest of the day, get away from it. Do something else. Because what we know is if you're overthinking things, you're eating away at the sugars and the glucose in the front part of your brain. You're eating away your adrenaline. So you become exhausted. You become tired. You're overthinking. So having rest and or active rest is really, really important throughout the season. That's one of the things I would say to you there, Shawn.
No, that's fantastic. I know we talked about the mindset at the beginning, Dan. I want to kind of get into two specific players that if we look at history, they're probably going to go 1A, 1B, depending on who your favorite is. Cristiano Ronaldo, Lionel Messi. And we already know they're already talented. We know they're physical specimen, one of them, and the other one's another physical specimen. But psychologically, because they're so unique of sustaining it about over a decade now. I mean, that is mental. That is mental about working and putting in that work day in, day out. When you are observing them as a elite psychologist and you're observing them, what is it that really you're like, this is why they're here. This is what's keeping them going. This is what, if any aspiring players want to follow in those footsteps, these are the traits that they got to question if they have or not, or they got to kind of create for themselves.
Yeah, they're very, very fascinating, aren't they? And again, just to reiterate, as a sports psychologist, from an ethical standpoint, I would say I unfortunately know neither of them personally or professionally. I'd love to. I've never had the chance to work with Barcelona or the teams that Ronaldo has played with, or at least during the times he's played with them. Look, I wonder if I can add any more than everyone knows already. I look at Ronaldo and I look at somebody who is highly motivated to get the very most out of his ability in his career. I'm fascinated with his passion to be a student of the game. I mean, he's there's an interesting juxtaposition in as much as he's very humble. The humble side of him is the one who worked tirelessly with René Meulenstein, the Dutch coach who was head coach under Sir Alex Ferguson for a period of time at Manchester United. And he started at Manchester United as a skills coach, and they worked together, him and Ronaldo, on his skills together. And that's testament to Ronaldo wanting to get the most from his ability. Whereas there's also there's a humbleness to him off the pitch, but there's an arrogance or a supreme confidence to his game on the pitch. So he's humble and he's arrogant, or confident is probably a better term. He has a real desire to win, which I think is very interesting as a sports psychologist, because so much of my work is not turning down the volume of of players wanting to win, but helping players to rationalize winning. A lot of my work is helping them to focus on the process rather than the winning itself. But Ronaldo gets very, very upset when he loses. He doesn't like to lose, does he? So he's certainly driven by winning. He's driven by his own personal ambition to find out how good he can be. He's not scared to challenge himself at new clubs. He's moved around, and that seems to be a driving motivator for him to go to a new environment, influence that environment, influence that organization, and challenge himself to fit into that organization. I think that's fascinating. Manchester United, Real Madrid, Juventus. So I think he's interesting, and yet a slightly different psychology, as you say, to Lionel Messi, the one club man, although hanging on by a thread right now to that one club, given everything that's going on. A clear loyalty to that one club. A loyal person for everything that he's got. Everything that he's going through now, but he's staying loyal to a degree. There's ins and outs of that at the moment. A player who thrives off the cognitive side of the game, the perceptual awareness side of the game, and that's not to diminish effort and energy. However, he's more likely to play, my understanding, from a perspective of time, space, ball, the relationship between the three, perception, action, scanning, those kind of cognitive elements, then that sort of grueling, brutal effort, possibly a thinker. More so than a warrior, an artist more than a warrior. That's not to say he doesn't have a warrior about him. A family man. What else can we say about him? In terms of natural talent, we look at Messi as an 8-year-old on YouTube, going through defenses in Rosario, Argentina, like a knife through butter. Things, Ronaldo had a great deal of ability, of course he did, at the Sporting Lisbon Academy, but it's almost as if Ronaldo has worked for things more so than Messi, and that's not to say that Messi hasn't worked for things, but you almost feel that the game intelligence has come more easily to Messi. So I think there's differences, there's gaping differences between the two from a psychological, mental, cognitive perspective. That's not to say they don't have a lot of similarities and a lot of overlapping qualities. But there's an interesting difference, just like there's the difference between their physique, for example. So I think they are certainly two fascinating players. I love them both. Difficult to separate for me, in my opinion.
No, that's great. That's great. One of the second to last questions I want to kind of get into is obviously we're in a unique time with this pandemic. This has really been demanding, and it has been demanding psychologically for a lot of people at the highest level, the average individual as well. But I want to talk about, with this unique time, as a sports psychologist, how have you been suggesting for coaches, helping coaches out, or players to stay driven what are the actions they've been doing in times where there was a good section of time that was ultimate lockdown, and you got to be indoors, you got to do stuff. But how do you kind of having that tunnel vision and say, you know what, this pandemic's going to end at some point. I can't fall behind. It's hard, but how do I stay driven as a coach? How do I still try to stay connected? How do I grow? How do I keep developing my team, keep enhancing my environment? What are the things you've been doing during this time that we can take into our own environment as well?
Well, several things to say there, Shawn. All well said and a good question. And I wonder, actually, you talk about tunnel vision, and I think it's been a time, a tragic time, but a time that has potentially afforded the opportunity for coaches to think more divergently rather than convergently. So by that I mean to diverge, to look elsewhere, to look at alternative ideas, to explore, to be curious and to explore different methodologies, processes and practices. It's afforded coaches the opportunity to do that when they wouldn't ordinarily have had that opportunity, perhaps. So I actually think it almost feels like, and I understand the frame of reference when it comes to tunnel vision, you're talking about staying on track and keeping on improving. And I just wonder if that improvement is looking out wide, far and wide. As a word of caution there, I would also add that I think during this time, there's been a lot of webinars out there, hasn't there, Shawn? Come on my free webinar, come on this, do that. Loads of free resources out there now since March. And I think actually coaches can do too much of that as well. They can go on too many webinars and actually not give themselves a chance to digest and think and actually make sense. Sense making is very important. Make sense of the information that they are taking in. Make sense of the webinars and free resources the webinars they're going on and the free resources they're being exposed to. So there's this, again, I'm going to use this term juxtaposition. There's this interesting narrative here, this trying to get this sweet spot is probably a better term between being curious and using this time as an opportunity to look far and wide and look at practices that might be different to what you're doing now, and yet not think too much about it and not go too far and wide and not do too much, so just trying to hit that sweet spot of education and self-development. What else to say? I just think from the player's perspective, enormously frustrating for players at all levels. And obviously this time has afforded them the opportunity to get out and with a ball and practice their juggling skills and things like that. And I think the most inventive ones have found activities that they can do. But certainly at the level that I'm working with, the elite adult level, they're so used to having activities given to them and turning up to the training ground and being given stuff to do. Where there's been a challenge for them is being able to structure their daily activities. Obviously everybody's back into soccer now at the adult elite level. They're back into training. But during that lockdown time, the conversations I very much revolved around helping them structure their time and organize their time. Some are just really good at doing that. Others need a little bit of help with that. And of course, the final thing to say is continues to be emotional for us all. And that's okay. That's okay. I don't think we need to think that we need to come out of this period of time having learnt 14 different languages and amassed a degree in mathematics. I really don't think so. We're allowed to be human and go, this is pretty rubbish right now. You know what? I'm going to veg out in front of Netflix. That's okay as well. So let's be reasonable here. But it's an opportunity, if we're not getting on the pitch, to just look at other ways to improve our game, essentially, and our coaching. So, yeah.
No, that's great. And I think like it's everybody's sometimes they say in a time where you're pushed against a wall, you're doing too much and doing less is actually not bad. Doing a time
Yep.
of reflection. Maybe you
Mm-hmm.
haven't had a chance to travel with the family, spend some family time, reflect a little bit, let the brain recover. It needs it maybe. You never know. Just listen to the body. My last thing is a question. It's a fun question. Um, it gets to know our guest a little bit more. Um, so basically, what I try to ask is your favorite team of all time and your favorite player of all time. But it doesn't have to be in the sport of soccer only. I don't want restriction. You have freedoms, and if you're tied between a couple, you can list that as well. The reason I say that is because I want to know why is that your favorite team and why is that your favorite player.
Oh, wow. That's the hardest question you've asked me. Uh, oh, look, I'm going to be probably, am I going to be pretty dull and boring here? Hmm. I'm going to say, hmm. Can I name a couple?
Like I said, no restriction. You can name a couple.
Look, I think that Barcelona team that went to Wembley in the Champions League final and beat Manchester United, what was it, 3-1, was just ridiculous. It's such a ridiculous team. The Brazil team 1970, clearly, Shawn, I'm going to say England 1966. Not that I was minus 11 at the time, so not conscious at that time, but absolutely biased Englishman. I think that he's won a curveball for you that maybe yourself and your listeners might not know much about, but the 2008 British cycling Olympic team that won so many gold medals and smashed the rest of the world, and had a at that time a very good process in place. I think unfortunately after that, there were some challenges within the environment there. But if you're British and you care about sport, we've had an interesting decade and a bit in Olympic Games. You know, we've finished. We don't go near beating the States, who finished first all the time in the medals table, but we finished, I think, fourth and third in the last two, something like that. And well, since 2008, we've done very well. There are some problems within our Olympic sports in terms of well-being and welfare and how we treat athletes. Just as, for instance, there was problems in US gymnastics, as you might know about. So things need to be improved. But that 2008 British cycling team was so exciting, and we won so many gold medals in that cycling team. In terms of individual competitor, look, without talking too much about his off-course antics, I mean, my background is I was a former professional golfer. So Tiger Woods, I just think, has just given us so many electric moments on the golf course. I think Roger Federer. I think Lionel Messi. I think those would be my three favourite, with very difficult to differentiate between those three. So there we go. That was a horrible question, Shawn. How dare you? That was impossible.
You answered it perfectly. I mean, those three choices could be formed into one. Imagine you had one sport for all three of them. Yeah. But again, Dan, absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for putting in the time. I really, what we try to do is put our guests to close us out, because we want you to kind of, anything you have going on in the world of football, soccer, we want our audience to know about. Where can they see more stuff of Dan Abraham and the psychology stuff if they want to understand more? Is there other resources you're providing for them to kind of use into their own environment. So if you can close us out, we'll go from there.
Sure. Well, thank you. Firstly, thank you so much, Shawn, for inviting me on your podcast. It's very kind of you. I've enjoyed our conversation. If you'd like to know more about my stuff, my website is danabrahams.com, and you can jump on there and you can see, my books, which you can purchase on Amazon. I've got 3 soccer ones. There's also an academy. I have an online academy that helps players, coaches, and parents work together on the mental side of the game. Those consist of animated videos. I have my own podcast. It's called The Sports Psych Show. I'm proud to say it's probably the most downloaded sports psychology podcast out there. Just largely because my guests are so good, not because I'm any good at hosting it, Shawn, but my guests are so good. And then wait for it here. I have a raft of social media. So Twitter, I have 3 Twitter accounts, but I'll give you the main one. That's at DanAbraham77. And I'm tweeting every day on soccer stuff, soccer philosophies and little psychological techniques. At DanAbrahams77. Follow me on Facebook at DanAbrahamsSoccer, where I'm there, and LinkedIn. I post a mini article, a mini post each day, every single day. At Instagram, or on Instagram, I should say, is at DanAbrahamsSport. At DanAbrahamsSport. And I think that's it, Shawn. I think that's it. So thank you so much for your time.
No, absolute pleasure. And we'll include all the social handles in the YouTube channel as well for our audience to follow as well. Again, Dan, thank you again.
Thank you very much.